Hello, welcome to A Friend Remembers, and the first of a Final Fantasy marathon chronicling the re-release and new releases of almost every game in the Final Fantasy franchise onto modern video game systems, consoles and PC in 2023. And this video is going to ask you the question of why it's worth your time and why you should play the original Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is one of the most important video games ever released. I'm not going to claim it's the best, it's old, and it's aged quite a lot in the decade since it originally came out. Hironobu Sakaguchi had led a team at the company Square, which was inspired by the recently released Dragon Warrior, known as Dragon Quest in the West, that showed that the Japanese version of the role-playing game series could work and function extremely well in a video game genre. He wanted to tell an epic and inspiring story that would attract players into the world and experience it. This game was one of the first role-playing games produced in Japan to gain popularity across the world, although its release was delayed by several years. It saw a modicum of success in the West, enough that although its sequel and sequel to that weren't released, that follow-on games in the series, I have to be honest, it wasn't really until Final Fantasy VII that the Final Fantasy franchise became the mega hit that the franchise is known for now. But this game set in place a lot of the tone, a lot of the genre, a lot of the elements that would follow the series all the way up to its 10th entry before it began to really deviate. This original game is available through numerous re-releases and remasters over the years. It's been ported so many times, I can't honestly recommend that you emulate or go back and find a copy of the original Nintendo Entertainment System. You might as well take one of the more modern re-releases. So for the gameplay of this video, you're looking at the Pixel Remasters. That is a 2D game that uses the sprite work of the original and tries to advance it forward a generation to look as if the game had been re-released on the Super Nintendo, but is still true to the spirit of what the original artwork and designs and pixel graphics of the original were coming out. I do recommend this over some of the other versions that have come out over the years. Pixel Remaster appears to be a very faithful retelling of the original games. However, there are other versions, particularly on the PSP or the Game Boy Advance, which contain bonus dungeons. But for the original classic experience, you're getting a fairly faithful recreation and retelling with just spruced up and more exciting graphics with the Pixel Remasters. There are also numerous quality of life changes that you can get. As much as I adore these games, the older JRPGs in particular are just held back by the architecture of old gaming designs, and there's all sorts of hold-ups, of little janks in the gameplay that can make you delay you, take your time up, and just repetitive gameplay that will slow you down and make you lose progress in infuriating ways. The Pixel Remasters effectively circumnavigate all of that by providing an effective checkpointing system, so even if you die, even if you are unfairly treated, and there are some particularly difficult fights in this game, not because they expect a high skill level, but just because the game will roll the dice and decide you've got no way forwards. But what is the gameplay of Final Fantasy? Well, it's got two components. One of them is a fetch quest set on an overworld map where you lead a team of 4 characters on a quest to recover 4 crystals that have been stolen by these arch-fiends and are being used to endanger the world. Once you've recovered the 4 crystals, you can then find out who is behind it, who set these fiends in motion, and face a final enemy with the fate of the world in tow. This fetch quest, essentially it's relatively simple. The gameplay slowly opens up. When you first start, you've got only the ability to walk over grasslands. Eventually you get access to a ship. However, there's only one small ocean that you can circumnavigate before eventually you open a chasm up. The ocean opens up into a larger ocean so you can explore a wider portion of the world. Then you get an airship so you can explore over mountains that were impenetrable from the ship. And you get a canoe so you can go up rivers and explore inland where your ship and airship hadn't been able to penetrate. There's a relatively quick progression of new transport options that allow you to find places and visit places that you haven't been before. There is a little bit of backtracking, but in this original game, I was really pleasantly surprised coming back how little backtracking you have to do. Its focus is always onwards and upwards. What's over the horizon? What new place do you need to go to? And as long as you talk to a couple of characters in the towns and cities that you visit along the way, you'll usually have a fairly good idea where you need to go to. The one possibly unfair thing that you might miss out on is finding the airship. It's buried in a desert. There is a character who will tell you that, but unless you know that you specifically need to stand on a certain tile on the world map, You could just accidentally avoid the airship and not have a clue where you're meant to find it. But save for that maybe one little oversight, it's fairly easy to find your way around. It's fairly easy to progress. And along the way, you will be constantly leveling up your characters in the form of random battles. So the game asks you at the very start of the game to pick 4 characters. There are 6 different job classes: fighter, red mage, black mage, white mage. You've got combat dealer, magical healer, magical offensive. Red mage, you can do a little bit of both. Then you've also got a thief and a monk, who have some slight twists on the fighter gameplay. The idea is to build a balanced party with offensive, physical, melee combat options, and the ability to use some degree of magic. Magic's extremely useful in your ability to heal yourself during and after battles, and the black mage can deliver some very high level spells that effectively act like a tank and can bring even the hardest enemies down. The problem is, though, the black mages really are glass cannons. They don't have a lot of health and they can be taken out easily, whereas the fighter is much more rugged, can take a lot more damage before he collapses. There's not many combat options and abilities to direct the enemy's firepower onto one character over another. This isn't an aggro-based gameplay. That hadn't been innovated yet. It's turn-based. Your 4 characters will each get a go, and then all of the enemies will each get a go. And then only once all of the enemies have had their turn do your 4 characters get to go again. This means in some of the later dungeons, because you don't just fight the enemies one at a time, they can gang up on you in crowds of up to 8 or more. Once all of them are attacking you with high-level attacks, they can wipe out your entire party in one round of attacks without you really having an opportunity to get around this. So it is important that you level up your characters. It's important that you engage in a certain number of random battle encounters, that you overcome enough enemies to power your characters up to the point where you can actually take on the harder enemies and ultimately the bosses, because each of the crystals is guarded by one of what's known as the 4 fiends, elemental enemies, which are the true skill checks that once you reach them, you've got to have reached a certain level of comprehension, a certain ability level, otherwise you're not going to get past. To be honest, I found on the Pixel Remaster version of the game it to be extremely well balanced. You can run from random encounters if you need to. I don't recommend doing it too often. On the Pixel Remasters, if you get tired of how little progress you're making, moving from space to space and these monsters just popping up and the screen preventing you from progressing, you can turn random battles off entirely if you want to. You can also do other things to make yourself level up faster, gain more experience points. I'm not engaging in any of that of this marathon of the series, but it's nice to see the options there for players with a little less patience than I have. But if you don't run from too many battles, you don't need to do much grinding. You will progress enough as you pass through the game. And this is where the autosave option really helps, because the way the gameplay works is once you reach a dungeon, several of these crystals or the items you need to collect to unlock the airship or the ability to pass from one place to another on the fetch quest, a lot of the items you need are in small underground dungeons. When I say small, they're actually big open spaces. They're more enormous halls with lots of doors for you to progress ever and deeper downwards. Very few of them are confusing. They're all well themed, but the idea here is that you're not meant to find it very easy to progress all the way down them in one go. You're not going to be strong enough. No individual battle in this game is meant to be particularly difficult, apart from the ones that are deliberately unfair, because they're there to show you that you're not ready and that the enemies are just going to outnumber you instantly. But save for those random difficulty spikes, the average battle, you should be able to take the enemies out without too much damage. The point of this game is that you only have so much magic at your disposal between rests. On each assault of the dungeon, although the Black Mage can dish a lot of damage out, they can only use that spell so many times. Each spell has a level, and you can use each level of spells a certain number of times before you need to rest and recover your magic points to be able to use that spell again. This essentially means although you have, if you have a Black Mage in your party, although you have the ability to deal a lot of the damage out, you need to be holding on to those spells for the boss. The tactics here and what the gameplay loop is testing of you is your patience and strategy, the ability to know when you need to use these attacks to get through versus when to hold back, when to preserve your ammunition to proceed. Exactly the same with the White Mage. You need to heal, you need to prevent your characters being ambushed and killed in battles, but if you use the healing magic up at the top of the dungeon, you're not going to have enough magic, you're not going to have enough stamina to get all the way through the dungeon and defeat the boss at the end. This is the point where if you turn off the random battle encounters, you're going to get a completely different gameplay loop. By buying items that allow you to heal without using magic, you get money from defeating enemies, using that money in shops and buying potions to heal yourself. By relying on your fighters, this is why you don't want a team that's entirely magic based. You need a fighter and someone who can dish out damage without consuming this ammunition. You'll be able to slowly work your way down to the bottom of the dungeon, take on the boss and move on to the next area without without wasting your ammunition, without leaving yourself powerless and unable to progress because you've not been tactical in how you used up your abilities. That's the true gameplay loop of Final Fantasy. It's about conserving your rations. It's about being a little bit tactical, not an individual combat encounter, but on a succession of them as you work your way to the bottom of the dungeon and then make your way back up to the surface after you've beaten the boss. The enemies, the monsters that you're going to fight are still going to be there along the way. With the benefits of all the advancements that the Pixel remasters can offer you, this game is not particularly long. I was able to beat it in under 10 hours. But I have played it before, over 10 years ago, but a lot of the gameplay loops here and the ideas and the concepts were familiar with me, even if I didn't have detailed knowledge of it. With the ability to autosave, so when you enter a level of a dungeon, you can, if you die, just restart there rather than hoping to go back to the surface or the nearest town, where in previous versions of the games that's the only place you could save. With the ability to reload anywhere in a dungeon if you are unfairly wiped out, and with the ability to turn off random encounters if you do completely run out of magic and healing, you can just say no more random encounters and you can safely make your way back to the surface without having to sacrifice the progress you've made over the time that you were questing. I think these are fantastic innovations that make the game so much more accessible to a modern audience. So if you are a true retro game purist, yeah, there's definitely a reason to go back to the original. But if you're just interested in this series, Final Fantasy is a saga which has had over 12.5 mainline video games in the franchise, so many spin-offs. It's fundamental for role-playing video games. This is so influential and so important to our modern culture. The music composed by Nobuo Uematsu, well, for the first 10 games in the franchise he was composing, the main composer for the series, and this game has so many little motifs that have stuck with us through the years. It's just fantastic to go back and hear the purest original version of this, whether that's with the original Nintendo Entertainment System sound chip or the reorchestrated newer versions which are fairly faithful to the tracks but have modern sounding orchestration. It does build on what Dragon Quest did. Now, in Europe and South America, maybe Sega was doing slightly better with Sega Master System compared to the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Phantasy Star in some of those areas would be the main competing RPG. You've got Final Fantasy, which made it in the West, and you've got Dragon Quest, which was always the biggest series in Japan. But these are the big three that I've now played all three of them this year, and of the original games, the one to check out is Final Fantasy. It's crude, it doesn't have any meaningful side quests, but it's fun, and despite the lack of storyline, there is a fun twist here. The very first villain you fight at the beginning of the game is a knight called Garland. Your first action is to rescue the princess. You do that within the first half an hour of the game, and then you go off on the quest to save the 4 elemental crystals from the Elemental Fiends. And then there's a big twist at the end. It brings time travel, it brings end of the world scenarios, it's suitably epic, and the final boss is suitably difficult. Whatever version of this game you play, I'd really recommend, if you've got any interest in Japanese role-playing games, if you've got any interest in the history of this franchise, if you've got any interest in 8-bit graphics, or any interest at all, I'd urge you to go and check out the original game in the series. It's old, it doesn't have, even with the Pixel remasters, they've not changed the core gameplay loop, they've not added any of the quality of the life things that would vary the series and shake it up, and some of the later entries will have some of these. The original game doesn't outstay its welcome. It's perfectly fun to play through today. I would recommend this to anyone with no hesitation.